Imagine a corporation so powerful that it could sign treaties, wage war, collect taxes, and decide the fate of millions. That sounds like dystopian fiction, but for more than 2 centuries it was a historical reality. The East India Company began in 1600 as a chartered trading company, a legal business entity created by the English crown to pursue profit in the Indian Ocean world. At first, this looked like a familiar commercial mission: buy goods where they are abundant, ship them to markets where demand is high, and return profits to investors. But embedded in its charter was something unusual and dangerous, a blend of private interest and public authority. It was not simply a merchant house. It was a corporation given political backing, monopoly privileges, and room to use force. Over time, those ingredients produced a system where trade opened the door, but coercion built the empire. To understand modern debates about corporate accountability, state capture, and extractive economics, you do not have to start in Silicon Valley. You can start here, with a company that became a state inside another state. The East India Company was formed as a joint stock company, meaning investors pooled capital and shared risk in long-distance trade ventures that were expensive and uncertain. This structure was innovative for its time because it allowed massive financing beyond what a single merchant could raise. Ships, crews, armed escorts, storage, insurance, and years-long voyages required deep pockets. Joint stock finance made that scale possible. But the company was not operating in a free market. It held chartered privileges that restricted competition from rival English merchants. In practice, monopoly rights converted political favor into commercial power. As the company expanded into markets across South and Southeast Asia, it dealt in high-value commodities like cotton textiles, silk, spices, indigo, tea, and later opium. These goods connected producers in Asia to consumers in Europe and beyond, helping shape an early form of globalized trade. At its height, the company reportedly handled an extraordinary share of world commerce. That concentration mattered because it meant decisions made in boardrooms in London could alter prices, labor patterns, and livelihoods across continents. In its early phases, the company still depended on negotiation with powerful Asian states. It established trading posts, sought licenses, and worked through local intermediaries. But commercial footholds can become political footholds when profit is tied to security. Company officials argued that protecting trade required fortifications, private troops, and direct influence over local rulers. This logic gradually normalized militarization. What started as defensive infrastructure expanded into offensive capacity. Over decades, the company developed presidency armies in Bengal, Madras, and Bombay. At certain points these forces totaled around 260,000 soldiers, roughly twice the size of the British Army. That number is not just dramatic trivia. It reveals how far the institution had moved from commerce to sovereignty-like power. A private company now possessed organized violence on a scale associated with states. The consequences were predictable. When disputes emerged over taxation, territory, or succession, the company could convert financial disputes into battlefield outcomes. Military superiority then reinforced revenue extraction, and revenue funded more military expansion, creating a self-feeding cycle of conquest through corporate machinery. A major turning point came with the Battle of Plassey in 1757. Plassey is often presented as a single military victory, but its deeper significance lies in what it unlocked institutionally. After this moment, the company was no longer just influencing politics from the edges. It was positioned to dominate governance in Bengal and then expand that model elsewhere. Territorial control gave it access to land revenue, and land revenue transformed its financial base. Instead of relying only on uncertain maritime profits, the company could tax agrarian populations directly. This shift from trade profit to tax extraction changed incentives profoundly. If your income comes from local production under your control, you begin to behave like a state, but without democratic accountability to the people being governed. The East India Company then grew through annexations, treaties, and pressure on princely states, extending influence across most of modern India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and into Lower Burma by the mid-19th century. Plassey thus marks not just a battle won, but a governance model born, private capital fused with territorial rule. Once the company became a territorial power, it had to administer people, not just products. In principle, governance implies responsibilities, justice, welfare, infrastructure, and stability. In practice, company administration was structured around fiscal extraction. Revenue targets were often prioritized over social resilience, and local populations bore the cost. Contemporary and later accounts describe abusive tax collection, including coercive and violent methods. Whether through direct force, legal pressure, or intermediary landlords acting under company demands, the system pushed peasants and artisans into vulnerability. Economic pressure was intensified by market disruptions tied to imperial trade priorities. Regions that once had diversified local economies became increasingly integrated into export-oriented systems vulnerable to price shocks and policy errors. This is a key pattern in extractive rule. When decision-makers are distant and incentives are financial, suffering can be dismissed as collateral rather than treated as policy failure. The East India Company did not invent exploitation, but it industrialized it through bureaucracy, accounting, and military enforcement, turning human distress into a line item beneath revenue goals. The Bengal famine of 1770 stands as one of the darkest outcomes associated with this system. Estimates often cite around 10 million deaths. Famines are rarely caused by nature alone, they are shaped by policy, distribution, and power. In Bengal, crop failures interacted with rigid revenue demands, market distortions, and inadequate relief. When administrations insist on collection even as agricultural systems collapse, vulnerability becomes catastrophe. The company's governance framework lacked both the incentives and accountability mechanisms to respond at the scale required. Officials had financial obligations upward to shareholders and political patrons, while starving populations had limited channels for redress. The result was not merely a humanitarian disaster but an exposure of structural violence embedded in extractive administration. Famine mortality on that scale also produced long-term social and economic damage, depopulated districts, broken local networks, reduced productive capacity, and deep mistrust of authorities. Discussing the East India Company without centering Bengal risks sanitizing history. The famine reveals what happens when a private governing power treats territory as an asset portfolio rather than a society of human beings. The company's commercial empire also reshaped global commodity flows in ways that linked everyday consumption to imperial coercion. Tea became central to British life, cotton and textiles fed industrial demand, indigo dyed fabrics, and opium became a strategic instrument in Asian trade balances. These were not isolated products moving neutrally through markets. They were embedded in unequal systems of production and exchange, often enforced by political pressure and military credibility. The company's reach into multiple commodity chains let it influence not just what was traded but how entire regions organized labor and land use. For producers in South Asia, that could mean increased exposure to fluctuating imperial demand and reduced control over local economic priorities. For consumers in Europe, cheap or steady supply often obscured the conditions under which goods were obtained. This asymmetry of visibility is common in imperial economies. Benefits are geographically concentrated in metropolitan centers, while social costs are dispersed among colonized populations. The East India Company became a machine that translated local extraction into global circulation, proving that supply chains can carry power imbalances as efficiently as they carry cargo. Despite vast revenues and influence, the company repeatedly faced financial crises and required government intervention. At first glance, this seems paradoxical. How can an institution that controls territory, trade, and taxation still be unstable? The answer lies in overexpansion, corruption risks, military costs, administrative overhead, and speculative expectations. Imperial governance is expensive, especially when maintained by force across diverse regions. Shareholders expected returns, officials sought advancement, and political actors in Britain wanted strategic gains, but the arithmetic often failed to align. This produced a familiar pattern still visible in modern political economy. Private actors capture profits in good times while public institutions absorb systemic risk in bad times. Parliamentary scrutiny and regulatory acts increased over time as scandals and instability grew harder to ignore. In other words, the British state both empowered and restrained the company, depending on circumstances. That uneasy partnership reveals a deeper lesson. When the boundary between corporation and state blurs, accountability can dissolve in both directions. Failures become everybody's problem while decision-making remains concentrated among a narrow elite. By the mid-19th century, resentment against company rule had accumulated across military, political, and social lines. The Indian Rebellion of 1857 was not a single-cause uprising, it was a broad rupture fueled by layered grievances, including military discontent, cultural tensions, annexation policies, and distrust of company authority. Once rebellion spread, it exposed the fragility of rule built on coercion and intermediated loyalty. Suppression was brutal, but the political consequence in Britain was decisive. Confidence in corporate governance of a vast colony collapsed. The Government of India Act of 1858 transferred control from the East India Company to the British Crown, initiating the formal British Raj. This did not end imperial domination, but it ended the company's direct role as a governing sovereign. Its armies were absorbed into state structures, and its administrative powers were stripped away. The transition marks an important distinction. The problem was not recognized as empire itself, but as empire outsourced to a corporation. Even after transfer, many extractive dynamics persisted, but responsibility was now officially governmental rather than corporate. After losing its governing functions, the East India Company became increasingly vestigial. It still existed legally for a period, but without meaningful sovereignty it was a shell of its former power. Final dissolution came in 1874 under the East India Stock Dividend Redemption Act, effectively ending an institution that had once rivaled states in reach and force. Looking back, its history compresses several big themes into one case study: financial innovation enabling large-scale ventures, monopoly privileges distorting markets, militarized commerce evolving into political control, and weak accountability producing human catastrophe. It also warns us against viewing corporations and governments as naturally separate spheres. Under certain legal and political conditions, they can fuse into structures that are highly efficient at extraction and dangerously insulated from those they govern. The East India Company's story is not merely about the past of South Asia or Britain. It is a structural blueprint for how concentrated power operates when profit, policy, and force align. That is why this history still matters. It helps us recognize similar patterns before they harden into new forms. If you found this helpful, please like this video and subscribe for more explainers.